Back on In Focus tonight, president, ministers and leaders of opposition political parties could soon get a 3.8% salary increase. This is according to the gazetted recommendation by the Independent Commission for the Remuneration of Public Office Bearers. The move has been met with criticism, with Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana saying that this is not tolerable, shall I say, as he recommended 1.5% as far as the pay hike is concerned. For some reaction now, let's speak to Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator, Matthew Parks. Matthew, good to have you. Thank you very much for your time. Pay bodies that recommend to government in other parts of the world are said to be independent. They sit down and they solicit input from labor, from economists, from experts within those particular fields. They look at inflation, they look at all sorts of things before coming up with this recommendation. Maybe a good place to start is was your input solicited? Were you approached to make any recommendations at all around this particular matter?
Yeah. Good evening. Thanks for having us. No, we weren't consulted as Cosatu. And I think we would agree with the Minister of Finance that this recommendation is unacceptable. It should be rejected. It can't be tolerated. In fact, it's completely tone deaf for this commission, who is meant to have a bit more sobriety and thought when it comes to such recommendations. You would imagine they would have taken into account the fiscal constraints facing government. You would have thought they would have taken into account that government itself has not been given inflation-linked increases to public servants, to nurses, to police officers, to cleaners, to security guards for quite some time. The state is drowning, trying to manage many fiscal crises. So it really makes no sense when government can't even offer its own public servants similar increases that we now think that the ministers and premiers and MECs and judges and magistrates should get these kind of increases. No, so it should be rejected. We think there is a need for the president not to agree to it. Ideally, we would love him actually to give a simple 0% increase. We know that might make us unpopular with politicians, and that's fine. But I think for us, we also have to question, why are we in this current fiscal crisis? Partly because many politicians, not all, but many, have really mismanaged the state to the point of collapse. So I think for us to send a right message to the public, we should be simply saying, well, politicians earn enough. They are taken care of. They are provided with ministerial housing, with government cars, etc. They don't pay for electricity and so forth. We understand, or utilities. They can afford to tighten their belt significantly. We're not saying they must be paid peanuts or to live in poverty. But we think that they can afford to tighten their belt. It would be a wrong message to simply say to politicians, we're giving a 3.8%. And we think we need to basically review how these recommendations are produced, because every year we have this discussion. Every year it leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of society, to nurses and to doctors and to police officers who get really paid a pittance in the public service at times. So let's have a better way of dealing with it. The current system doesn't work. There is a private member's bill before Parliament right now which is saying we need to have a discussion. And I think also we need to link it to the ministerial handbook as well, because members of the executive are not just getting a salary from the state, which this one is linked to, but they're provided with a ministerial handbook, benefits, privileges, comfort, etc. So let's have a more holistic discussion about what is the right approach to take. But I think right now it would be a very wrong message to say we should be giving politicians an increase currently.
It, of course, raises the question of the legitimacy of the process, as you put it, and maybe we're correct to ask this particular specific question. Who is this group that actually sits? Who sits on this pay review body and makes this decision?
So, I mean, look, it's a creature of Parliament. It's established by Parliament. It looks at the salaries, the packages of politicians or members of the executive committee, rather, at national and provincial level. It also looks at what the judges and magistrates are paid as well. So it's a significant institution. But I think right now it might have made sense that time, but it no longer makes sense. Not when you've had a decade of state capture, not when the state's been run into the ground, when society is really struggling and the state itself is struggling. And yet, year after year, we have these very kind of tone-deaf recommendations from this commission. Amazingly, even former President Zuma felt offended by them and often rejected their increases, often giving simply a 0% increase to members of the executive. So I think we do need to have a broader discussion about what is the right place to do it. Do you also want to allow politicians to have a say? Because, these recommendations, the increases for members of parliament, ultimately they are approved by the president and in case of members of parliament, also by parliament itself. And there is a little bit of a conflict of interest there as well. And perhaps we should find a better way of having a more representative body making these kind of determinations, having some public consultation and transparency, and not simply presenting a fait accompli. But I think we do welcome the Minister of Finance's sober stance that they can't support a 3.8%. That's positive. Yeah. We might disagree about their recommendation for 1.5, but that's a positive sense of humility from the Ministry of Finance to say, look, this is a wrong message, it's the wrong time, the optics look terrible.
The Commission could argue, Matthew, and say, well, compared to what Cosatu was asking for, at least even unions affiliated with Cosatu, this is substantially below inflation. In fact, the earning growth remains very, very low, even if we would suggest 3.8%.
No, sure, and we would love to have our members change, seats with members of the executive or judges. So, a police officer or a constable makes 180,000 rand. He would love to earn the salary of a police minister who makes 2.4 million rand and lives in government housing. Similarly, a nurse would love to change seats with the Minister of Health. I'm sure law clerks in the courts who get paid a pittance would love to earn the salary of a magistrate. So we can happily negotiate a compromise and a swap that we can take minor increases for public servants that they can get the salaries of politicians and judges. That would be a very wonderful day for public servants. But I think we can't compare apples with oranges. What we pay nurses and police officers and correctional service wardens, cleaners and security guards is not enough to live on. That's why most of them are drowning in debt. And that's why I think also why workers across the country in Cosatu are offended by these increases for politicians, because we're paying our workers a pittance, we're paying those on top a fortune, we really need to have a more just and more inclusive society. But I think to be fair to government, we should also be having the same discussion about the private sector, because in the private sector it's far worse. In government, the wage ratio gap might be 1 to 13, for example. In the private sector, it can be 1 to 50. You have the CEOs of the big 5 banking corporations earning on average 150,000 rand every single year. The bank tellers, who are often retrenched, get paid a pittance. We have mining company executives getting paid 200 million rand a year, yet when the mine workers ask for 150 rand increase a month, barely enough to buy lunch at KFC. They are told to go and play outside. So I think let's have this discussion with government, but let's also have a more inclusive approach to society as well, which includes the private sector. Because again, private companies are not funded by money from the trees. They are funded by workers' pension funds who are investing in them across the stock market. Yeah. We need to have a more inclusive approach to society at large.
So taking into context that economic environment, the amount of pay increases that is given to public servants, the performance economically of this particular government, one would say, what would be the conditions attached to the pay freeze? I mean, if we're saying, okay, pay freeze, maybe for how many years, or maybe for the next 3 years, what would be the conditions that we attach to that?
A pay freeze for politicians?
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. Look, I mean, so one is not blind to the realities of inflation and so forth. And if the economy was performing well, if the fiscus was in good health, the public servants were getting paid a decent wage, we would not have a problem as with previous years under the previous administrations of Mandela or Mbeki, etc., where politicians got an increase. I think there was concerns about the wage gap. But I think right now in this climate, we can't support it. Not when the state is drowning in debt, when it's struggling to provide SOD grants for 8 million unemployed people, when it's cutting the presidential employment stimulus left, right, and center, almost to the point of closing it down. When we're struggling to see many of our SOEs survive, many of them are drowning in debt. So I think in that scenario, we wouldn't want to see politicians getting increased. We don't think any of them will be plunged into poverty, because if you're getting paid 2.4 million a year as a minister, that should be enough to keep you going for a little bit, Yeah.
So what you're saying that, for example, if we're still getting the report from Treasury that says no, our debt to GDP is rising, there shouldn't be a pay increase for politicians. If we are still seeing budget cuts, there shouldn't be a pay rise to politicians. If there's still inability, for example, to give increases to teachers, nurses, and police officers in this country, we shouldn't even be considering talking about an increase for politicians.
No, exactly. I mean, we've spent the last 2 weeks celebrating the memory and the legacies of Chris Hani, Oliver Tambo, we should be saying let's have progressive principles attached to these kind of scenarios. So the kind of principles you're mentioning right now, but ensuring that the money that goes to where it's needed, to the unemployed, to the poor, it goes to rebuilding the state that society depends upon to provide quality public services, to ensure that nurses are paid a living wage. That should be the focus. We should not be prioritizing the packages of politicians who really are well taken care of, to be honest.
Final one before I let you go. I mean, are there specific groups within that particular cohort that is being reviewed by the Commission that you think would deserve an increase?
Yeah. Look, I mean, we don't want to focus on individuals because we know there are ministers who do excellent work, to be fair. There are ministers who really put the interests of the poor, of workers at heart, work flat and do good work, But I think we must take a principled approach which looks at the collective of cabinet and so forth, of provincial executive committees. We should also be including many of the Mayoral committees as well. And often those are not affordable. There are just simply too many of them at 259. And if you say, let's look at the fiscal package overall. What is it able to prioritize? Who needs help the most? And right now, when times are tough, we should be saying that whatever resources we have should be geared towards providing solidarity to the poor, to the unemployed, to those who simply can't make month end, who are drowning in debt. And we think we can afford to show that those on top can make some sacrifices. We all pay lip service to the memories of, Thomas Sankara, progressive, humble revolutionaries. We, idolize their sense of humility. Yet when it comes to our own backyard, then we tend to be a little bit hypocritical, if I can be a little bit honest. So I think it is a useful time to begin to revisit the traditional values of the liberation movement of the ANC and say, let's lead by the front. Politicians can afford to make some sacrifices, while society itself, we're asking them to make sacrifices in these dark times.
Matthew, as always, much appreciated. Thank you very much for coming on. Parliamentary Coordinator there for Cosatu, Matthew Parks.